U.S. President Joe Biden is to travel to the state of Florida this weekend to assess the damage caused by Hurricane Idalia. The storm was the strongest to make landfall in the Big Bend region in more than 125 years. Heavy rain and winds caused major destruction along the state's Gulf Coast. Idalia moved northeast, wreaking havoc in Georgia and the Carolinas. It has since been downgraded to a tropical storm. Cleanup efforts are being complicated by the lingering floodwaters.
The storm may have passed, but the deluge still remains. Category 3 Hurricane Idalia wove a path of destruction across Florida's largely rural northwest, causing an estimated more than $9 billion in damage and leaving more than 140,000 homes without power. And when the worst of the storm was over, the residents across the regions began returning to their homes to begin assessing the damage.
What matters is what I'm holding right here, okay? It's just material stuff.
I know, it's just our retirement, our own life.
It's material. We're going to rebuild.
23 years.
It's going to be good. It's going to be fun.
Meanwhile, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announced measures to help those who'd been affected by the storm.
We have requested from the federal government a major disaster declaration for all 25 counties that fell under the hurricane warning. This will allow us to start debris removal and will provide funding for individual assistance, which includes shelter and temporary housing for impacted individuals.
And while Florida began the cleanup operation, Hurricane Idalia barreled across Georgia and the Carolinas, where heavy downpours caused flooding and created short-lived tornadoes, which left a trail of devastation as the storm made its way to the Atlantic Ocean. And now the worst has passed. Dripping wet and covered in debris, the people of these southeastern states face the unenviable task of rebuilding the communities that they call home.
We can now speak to Ethan Foreheads from the disaster relief organization Convoy of Hope. He joins us from Perry in Florida. Mr. Foreheads, good to see you. Now, the extent of the damage is slowly becoming more and more visible. What's most needed at this point?
I think the power to get back on. I think that's the thing that is really holding up a lot of people's lives as they begin to get back to normal. It's always a major, major first step in getting back to life. But power is out for thousands and thousands of people, especially in this area of Perry. It's very rural near Steinhatchee, which is right near where the storm came ashore, roared ashore a couple of days ago. So a lot of people here wanting to get that power back on because it is hot in Florida this time of year. And until the power gets on, the stores can't operate, the gas stations can't operate, and life really cannot get back to normal.
Yeah, very difficult circumstances you're describing there. How are the affected communities helping themselves and dealing with the situation?
Well, organizations like Convoy of Hope are coming down to help them, to offer them relief supplies. There's lots of organizations doing that. We see people from all across the country coming to help people in Florida, even came before the hurricane hit, knowing where it was headed. And the people here are resilient. They've been through storms before. This is actually the strongest hurricane to ever hit the Big Bend area of Florida. So they haven't quite lived through this yet. But the people that we've talked to they're hanging in there. They're grateful that it wasn't worse because they were honestly expecting it to be a little bit worse. So the big issues now are the storm surge, the flooding that was caused down closer to the Gulf. And then we're about 30 minutes away from that. Where we are, it's high winds that caused a lot of the problem.
Mm-hmm. Your organization, Convoy of Hope, has been operating for almost 30 years now in crisis aid. Can you help us understand the extent of the damage Idalia has left behind compared to other disasters?
Yeah, every disaster is different, but it's all the same in the needs that people have immediately following. They need the things that are basic, food and water and tarps for their roofs, those sorts of things. So when you compare this to other storms, Hurricane Ian was the last major storm that Florida had. That caused problems for a very long time. It was a very wide, slow-moving storm, and I think that made a big difference with Idalia in that it was a fast-moving storm. So it didn't just sit on one location and dump a bunch of water. It brought a lot of storm surge onto the shore, don't get me wrong, but it didn't dump the rain that I think think some other hurricanes have dumped. And for that, the people of Florida are thankful.
Now we're talking about rebuilding, but also maybe building more resilient structures. How can people brace themselves in the process of rebuilding for storms that may come after this one?
You know, it's a tough thing. This is a lower income area where we are, and it's difficult because all those things exist. The hurricane windows, hurricane roofing, all that resistant roofing, all that stuff exists, but it is very expensive to build a house with those items on board. So that's what makes it difficult for the people of Florida, is trying to manage the financial discrepancy between one price and the other price for safety. And the people of this area, they'll tell you that they've never seen a storm like this. So maybe they're more likely, perhaps, to rebuild the same way and pray that it's another 100+ years.
Ethan Forhetz, thank you so much. The people taking stock of the damage caused by Idalia are hoping to rebuild fast and return to normality as quickly as possible. But with damages in the millions, the question is, who's going to foot the bill? Noah Gordon is the acting co-director of the climate program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. He recently co-authored an article titled "Who Pays for Extreme Weather?" And he's here to talk about just that. Mr. Gordon, welcome to DW. Now, Hurricane Idalia leaves behind a trail of destruction. 9 of the 10 costliest hurricanes have occurred in the past 20 years. What is making these storms so expensive in terms of property and infrastructure losses?
Climate change is one reason that these storms are becoming more damaging. You know, hurricanes are a type of weather disaster that can be made more serious by climate change. While there's no evidence that the storms are becoming more frequent, they are becoming on average more damaging as hot oceans fuel more energy, hold more energy to fuel them, and sea levels are higher, so coastal flooding is worse. There's also the fact that more people live in these areas close to the ocean and are vulnerable to such storms.
Yeah, and those people are precisely right now finding it harder and harder to insure themselves against the damage caused by natural disasters. The business model of insurance companies is based on the assumption that the insured event is very unlikely to take place. With climate change, as you just described, making extreme events more frequent and devastating, is that model even tenable anymore?
There are signs that in the United States that model is breaking in some places. Homeowners insurance costs in Florida, where this most recent hurricane did so much damage, are up over 50% since 2015 and now costing the average homeowner over $3,000 a year. And, you know, in other parts of the country, in California, for example, you've seen the 2 largest insurers in the state, Allstate and State Farm, pull out of the state altogether and stop issuing new policies because they can no longer bear the costs of the wildfire damage you've seen in California. In 2018, you know, the hurricanes in 2017 and 2018 in California wiped out all the homeowners insurance profits from the last 20 years in the state. So there are signs that the model is no longer working. As you said earlier, someone has to pay for extreme weather. It's either private insurers, or it's the taxpayers through the government, or it's the poor people whose homes have been destroyed.
Who is more likely to bear that burden? Can people rely on the government to help out?
For flood insurance, they can in some cases. You know, the federal government set up in the 1960s a national flood insurance program when private insurers were pulling out of the market because of, you know, hurricanes that happened in the 60s and flooding from the Mississippi River. But that program doesn't have enough money. The cost of the premiums that people pay does not reflect the risk of high flooding. So the federal government, that program is in a major deficit, and the Biden administration is now trying to raise people's premiums so that it reflects the cost. But some states, including Florida, are suing to stop this from happening. So you have obstacles to one of the solutions that could persuade people to try to take more measures to protect their homes or consider moving to safer areas.
How big a role do you think it plays on the state level? Because on the federal level, you know, Joe Biden has said time and again that all of these extreme weather events can very well be attributed to climate change. But there are people in power in some of the most affected states that deny climate change. How big a factor is that in the help that the affected people can rely on in case of the worst happening?
It's certainly a relevant factor. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is one of those people who either denies or plays down climate change. And there are some state and local programs that try to provide incentives for people to leave floodplain areas or encourage them to rebuild elsewhere if their home has been destroyed several times in the Florida Keys. But those programs, we're still seeing net inflows of people to vulnerable areas like Arizona, where there's extreme heat, or Florida, where you have hurricanes. So these programs that encourage what we call, managed retreat, people resettling to slightly safer areas, are not able to keep up with the demand of people who want to live in Florida or Arizona. So the state level certainly matters.
You talk about these programs. Are those government-sponsored programs, or is that a private initiative or an NGO that is telling people, hey, we have to adapt to these new circumstances. We can't keep living where we're living, rebuilding again and again. We have to rebuild in different areas and in different ways, possibly, as well.
These are government-sponsored programs for managed retreat that are slowly getting larger. I mean, the private company's version of that is unfortunately what you see in California, for example, when a private insurer decides that the business model is no longer working, and when private insurers pull out, the cost of buying a home gets more expensive, and some people may decide that they can no longer afford to rebuild. So it's better to do this in an organized manner through the government than just have a chaotic situation where private insurers are pulling out and no one is sure who's going to pay the cost of this extreme weather.
Now, if climate models play out as projected, are we looking at parts of the U.S. that could become unaffordable? You just mentioned the example of California, unaffordable for all but the super rich.
That's certainly a problem. You see, in California, after a forest fire devastates an area, it's maybe the wealthiest people or the people with the best insurance that can afford to rebuild. And other people, they may get an insurance payout, but it's not enough to buy a home in an area where home prices have been increasing. So you see a sort of gentrification by wildfire. And, we have projections of climate damage, not just from bodies like the IPCC, but also from reinsurers like Swiss Re, who estimate that even with a 2-degree rise in global temperatures, U.S. GDP could go down by 7 or 10%. So things are projected to get worse, and government has to take stronger action to help people.
That's a clear message. Noah Gordon of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.